afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to, this is a combination of all things fulfilled and labor not in vain. I'm here with Daniel Rogers from Piedmont, Alabama. And we've had an experience at the Southaven lectures, and so we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of speeches. Daniel, welcome today. How are you doing?
Pretty good, William. Appreciate you having me on and having me in your home this week. Well, at least for the first 2 days of the lectureship.
Well, good. Okay, well, we had an interesting morning. I don't know where you want to start with this discussion, but we're just kind of basically giving you an update on the lectures that we attended. We heard a few from B.J. Clark, who is the current director at the Memphis School of Preaching, and from Will Hanstein, and also from Drew Leonard, and the other gentleman's name was Keith Ritchie. All right, and maybe Daniel can remember all of the topics, but we're going to talk a little bit about, kind of what went on. So, Daniel, why don't you kind of lead us into where we're going to discuss it.
All right, so the Southaven Power Lectureships at the Southaven Church of Christ in Southaven, Mississippi is on the end of time this week. They began yesterday, and it's going to continue until Thursday. And B.J. Clark started it off last night with the lectures that we attended by doing a play-by-play of the final Judgment Day. Today we had, how did you pronounce his last name? Will Hanstein?
Hanstein, I think is his name.
He did a lesson on Matthew 7:21-23 called "Not Everyone That Says to Me, Lord, Lord." The second speaker of today, the third speech that we heard, was made by Keith Ritchie, and he did one on Matthew 24:36, and it was called "But of That Day and Hour." And then Drew Leonard, the author of a book attempting to refute the truth of covenant eschatology, he did a speech on what he called AD-70ism. And as defined by the second speaker, the word ism means it ain't so. So that's the speeches that we heard, and that's some of the topics we're going to have on the discussion for you today.
All right, well, very good. I think we were going to focus a little bit on Drew Leonard's speech to start. He started off his speech by calling both Daniel and myself out publicly from the pulpit and to talk about things. And we had just had a very cordial conversation with him prior to his speech. So it wasn't anything that we took as, highly offensive or anything. But yet he did publicly, call us out and from the pulpit and began to address some things on covenant eschatology. One of his major arguments in the presentation and his approach was that he was going to refute covenant eschatology. He wasn't affirming anything. He was just going to refute what we taught. And of course, in his opinion, the word mellow and the imminence implied in certain uses of the term was the point of initial discussion. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in terms of mellow. So Daniel, why don't you start us off, and would you pass me that little book right there that a good friend of mine wrote?
Now, the thing about it is that he did not, if I remember correctly, he didn't outright deny that mellow could mean soon to come to pass. But what he did deny, what he said was, if I can show you one case where that doesn't make any sense, then you can't use that as an argument. Now, that's not really good argumentation. Just because I can show you how heaven and earth is used to talk about the kingdom of Babylon in Isaiah chapter 13, that doesn't mean that I have to automatically assume that every passage that mentions heaven and earth is talking about Babylon or is talking about another kingdom, or that it's talking about the physical heaven and earth. Just because a word is not used in one place in a certain way doesn't negate our ability to use that word elsewhere.
Exactly. That's an excellent point. You could even talk about, the cross in many ways. Jesus suffered on a physical cross, but at the same time he tells us to take up our cross, and that doesn't mean that we must get on a physical cross. So the point of trying to take a word and say that if I can just refute it over here or show this one incident where it doesn't mean that, actually refutes all the other passages, will negate a lot of the teachings in the scripture. So excellent point, and I think it's a good start in terms of where we're going.
Yeah, now he did challenge us. He said, he challenged the whole audience, not just William and I. He said, go home, read your lexicons, and you're going to find that mellow does not, mean at hand. It's not a appropriate, replacement for the phrase at hand, because he pulled up a quote by Max King that said that when you see mellow used in the Greek, it can be translated as at hand. It's sort of an equivalent to that. But we're going to read from some lexicons and from some other sources as well right now to show you what they say about the phrase mellow used with an infinitive.
All right.
All right, so the first one that we have is the one that he specifically referenced, and that was theirs. Now, this Greek word is mellow, and it comes in the Greek number 3195, according to the Thayer's numbering system. And so here's what he says under definition number 2. He says, joined to an infinitive. A, to be on the point of doing or suffering something. And so Thayer's primary definition of mellow when joined with an infinitive is to be on the point of doing or suffering something. And William actually has some comments about something that Drew brought up about the future infinitive as opposed to an aorist infinitive or present infinitive, right?
Well, there are several things here. One is the word mellow occurs 111 times in the New Testament. And the percentage of times that the word is translated as imminent varies from version to version. So just depending on, what translation you pick up, it's going to vary out of those 111 times that it appears. From a minimum of a single time by the Wycliffe translation to a maximum of 108 times by the Kingdom Interlinear translation of the Greek scriptures. And then secondly, out of the 111 times that mellow occurs in the New Testament, 50 of those references relate to eschatology, or the end time. And the number of times mellow is translated to mean imminent or soon to occur ranges from 0, according to Barclay's New Testament, the King James Version, Cranmer, Geneva Bible, Tyndale, the New Testament, English version for the deaf, Beck's translation of the New Testament, to 49 times, according to the Concordant Literal New Testament, Weymouth's version, New Testament in modern speech. Young's literal translation of the New Testament renders 35 out of 50, along with Weymouth. So what's the point here? Why is there such a wide disparity and disagreement on how to render the word mellow? And it cannot be doubted that bias exists in the scholarly world on this term, and translators refuse to accurately and honorably translate this term to mean imminence. But the evidence is overwhelming that it means imminence, especially when it is used with the present infinitive. Now, some have cited Greek scholars regarding the future infinitive, saying that it does not specify any time element between the prophetic statement and its fulfillment. So let's just grant that for the sake of argument. If the term mellow does not specify any time, then no argument can be made for or against the time, for no time would be inherent in the passage. This means, or inherent, this means that we will have to use the other time passages to understand some of the elements of the event, or the time element of the event. And that is a principle of Dungan's hermeneutics, one with which many cannot agree. And let me just say this quickly before we go to any other points. The argument had to do with mellow not meaning at hand in certain passages, and particularly in coming passages. One of the things that I noted was that there was no reference. There was a reference to Acts 24, even though I don't think he actually quoted the text, but he did mention the text. Acts chapter 24, verses 14 and 15, which does mention mellow, where Paul said there is about to be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and of the unjust, which is a quote from Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2. But here's the point. Paul also quotes Daniel 12:2 in Romans 13, 11 and 12, and uses the word ingus, or at hand, in that text, and therefore states very clearly regarding the same subject that the resurrection of the just and the unjust, which is Daniel 12:2, quoted from both Acts 24, 14 and 15, and also Romans 13, 11, and 12, that it does mean at hand. That's a point that continues to be ignored when people are examining that particular text and that word.
Right, and I pulled up on my phone, he mentioned Young's literal translation. Young's literal translation in both Acts 24, 14 and 15 and Acts 17, verses 30 and 31 translate mellow as about to be. Paul said in Acts 24, verse 15, according to the Young's literal translation, having hope toward God, which they themselves also wait for, that there is about to be a rising again of the dead. And that's the exact same way he translated it in Acts 17 and verse 31. He says, he set a day in which he is about to judge the world in righteousness. Now that's how Young's literal translation has it. So he saw the force of the Greek, and he, in trying to have a literal translation, wanted to make it as literal as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so I think you have another lexicon that you wanted to read from, and this is Baxter's, or the Analytical Greek Lexicon Revised. That's the 1978 edition. I have a later edition, but I think they're pretty much the same on the term mellow.
All right, this is on page 262 of this edition. Under mellow, he says, to be about to be on the point of. And so, again, we see that the primary definition of this word here is it's about to take place. It's imminent. It's right there looming on the horizon. And that's how the New Testament writers use it. That's how Young's literal translation translated it. And so that's how we're going to believe it.
Okay. Did you have any more sources that you wanted to consult?
Yes. One final source, lexicon. See, William's got a great library. I don't have this kind of. I've got to use Google. But he's got a great library. And William, if you would.
That's Walter Bauer.
Right.
The Arndt and Gingrich lexicon, and pretty much well known by most people who do, Greek study research.
Okay. He says here under mellow, let's see, to be on the point of, to be about to be revealed. And here's a passage that he says means about to be revealed, Romans 8:18.
Wow.
Yeah.
Definitely so. So he quotes that passage. And says it means about to be.
That's right. That's his primary passage under the heading about to be.
And that's in the context, Daniel, of Romans 8:23, which talks about the redemption of the body. The adoption, which is the redemption of the body.
And Drew Leonard, in his speech, equated Romans 8:23 to Hebrews 9:28. The salvation that would come at the second appearing of Christ, he said, is the redemption of the body of Romans 8:23.
And even as he quoted that, however, he acknowledged that there were some passages in the book of Hebrews that refer to 70 A.D., particularly Hebrews 10 and 25.
Right.
Go ahead.
A passage historically used in the Churches of Christ as a you better come to Wednesday night Bible study passage. And Drew Leonard took that passage and applied it to, he didn't define what it was specifically, but a soon-to-come judgment.
Absolutely. And another point on Hebrews 9:28, which he quoted, was the fact that in that context of the coming of the Lord, you have Hebrews 10 and verse 37, which he, by the way, did not quote, that says, in a very, very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. And in that context, he uses the Greek phrase, mikron hosan hosan. So it's a very imminent statement to talk about the coming of the Lord, and that's in the same context of Hebrews 9 and verse 28. So you have that entire context of Hebrews 9, which is the coming of the Lord, verse 28, and then you have 10:25 that talks about the judgment, and by the way, quotes from Deuteronomy in Hebrews 10:31 and 32, I think it is, or is it 35? I think it's 31. To Hebrews 10:30. Hebrews 10:30, that refers back to Deuteronomy 32, which talks about the judgment being at hand. So you have the word at hand used there. You have in a very, very little while, all right? And then you have the statement in Hebrews 9:28, all speaking of the coming of the Lord and the day approaching, Hebrews 10:25, which he agreed to be 70 A.D. So his arguments on mellow just dovetail, and that's twice that we've shown you from Romans 13:11 and 12 that it was at hand, and also from the context of Hebrews 10 that it was at hand, and stated so with a quote from the Old Testament, which of course they contradict themselves in saying that it was all fulfilled in 30 AD, but was actually fulfilled in 70 AD.
Right, which, to be fair, I guess Drew Leonard would say that there's Old Testament passages after the cross, but he doesn't see the train coming.
Right, he doesn't see the implication of his points in terms of saying that, because he quoted Colossians 2 as well as Ephesians 2 to say that the law ended at the cross. But what he's going to do, what he's doing there is he's creating a dichotomy between the fulfillment of the law and the prophets.
Exactly, that's what I meant by he doesn't see that train coming. I mean, another thing with Hebrews 9:28 is he misses the point of the second appearing of Jesus, which is to fulfill the types and shadows in the high priest role. And by the way, fulfilling the types and shadows of the role of the high priest would bring about the completion of the new covenant and the taking away of the old, which is what he says in Hebrews 10. I come to do thy will, O God. I take away the first, that he may establish the second.
Exactly. And even before you get there, after you look at Hebrews 9:28, the first verse of chapter 10 says, for the law having a shadow of things about to come. So it's discussing things that were in the law, that the typical fulfillment of the role of the high priest is definitely what that context is about.
Now, William, if you have a light source and you have something blocking that light source and you take it out of the way, it doesn't cast a shadow anymore, does it?
That's right.
Now, he's got the law being taken away at the cross. That means you have to take away the shadows. And yet the Hebrews writer, as well as Paul in Colossians chapter 3, could look, or Colossians chapter 2, could look at that light source. They could see that day approaching, and they saw that shadow cast from the old law. It hadn't been taken out of the way yet.
Absolutely. Now, he attempted to address Mello as being not at hand from Matthew 16:27 and 28, which I thought was a very novel approach for most people who are millennials in the Church of Christ on Matthew 16:27 and 28. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you watch the GBN presentation from a couple weeks ago, well, we might need to say something about that.
Okay, go ahead.
But we'll just wait for now. But if you watch that GBN presentation, you'll see they made a very interesting argument about the word power in Mark 9:1, which is the parallel to Matthew 16:28. And the argument goes like this. The kingdom would come with power and great glory. Luke 24 Jesus tells the apostles, you'll be endued with power from on high. In Acts chapter 1, Jesus tells his apostles, stay in Jerusalem. Not many days hence, you'll receive the power of the Holy Ghost. And then they see that come to fulfillment, and they say, okay, the power of the kingdom came in AD 33 on the day of Pentecost.
Well, and somebody actually quoted that this morning. Did they not?
Yes. And they did, and last night as well, I believe. I think B.J. Clark did that. Well, Drew Leonard gets up in contrast to all of these guys, and he says Matthew 16:27 and 28 is the vindication of the kingdom of God in AD 70. Now he says it came on and it was established on Pentecost, but it was vindicated in AD 70 at the coming of the Lord with all of his angels to reward every man according to his works.
Exactly.
He said that's AD 70, Matthew 16:27, 28.
Yeah. We sat there just absolutely, amazed that he would take that approach. And
if you can't beat him, join him.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and in one sense, sort of chided the audience for even seeing it a little bit differently.
He did. He said, you can believe Revelation's future, but it's already been fulfilled. He thinks it was fulfilled at the fall of Rome. He says you can say at hand doesn't mean at hand, but you're wrong. At hand always means at hand. But apparently that means 400.
Well, that brings up an interesting point, Daniel, because if Matthew 16:27 and 28 was the vindication of the coming of the kingdom in 70 AD, according to Drew Leonard, I wonder what his position is on Revelation 22:11 and 12. Is he going to see that as 70 AD, or is he going to apply that to the fulfillment of Rome?
Well, if he's consistent, he would apply it to Rome, I suppose.
Yeah.
Consistent with what he said.
Exactly. Exactly.
Now, if he was biblically consistent, he would see there's only one vindication of the kingdom. Same with Revelation 11. At the fall of the city where the Lord was slain, here you have the kingdom of God. And see, he sees that in Matthew 16. Mm-hmm. But when he gets to Romans 11, he has to say that's the fall of Rome. At least I think that's what he would say.
So how did he attempt to address the fact that Mello was used in Matthew 16:27 and 28 in terms of the coming of the kingdom? he had, and you remember the argument that he made from 2 Thessalonians,
Right.
where he said he's going to demonstrate that that could not be a reference to the coming of the Lord because 20 years later, Paul wrote that it was not at hand.
Right. So if I say, I'm going to give you a gift shortly, William comes along and say, Daniel's not going to give you a gift shortly, and we're both telling the truth, it must be two different gifts. Right? So
Right.
he's saying that Jesus is saying it's at hand, and he agrees with it, that it was at hand. But then he gets to Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2, and Paul says in the King James Version, don't let anyone trick you to think that the coming of the Lord is at hand. And so Drew Leonard says they must obviously be talking about two different comings of the Lord. One in AD 70, Matthew 16, 27, 28, and then the other at some future point past AD 70.
Right. And what's interesting about that is he's got a 20-year gap between Matthew 16, 27 and 28 and 2 Thessalonians 2. But then about 10 years later, here you have, and he even cited some of these passages. You have, because he had James 5, 7, and 8 on the board. And so you have James 5, 7, and 8 that talks about the coming of the Lord having drawn near. You have 1 Peter 4, 7 saying the end of all things is at hand and the time for the judgment had come, which these guys have admitted in debate, refers to 70 AD. And then you have Philippians 4, 5 saying that the coming of the Lord was at hand. So you take Matthew 16, 27 and say Mello says is at hand, and you agree with that. And then you use 2 Thessalonians to say that it's not at hand, and then within 10 years, you have the apostles again saying that the coming of the Lord is at hand. So how would he distinguish? And how does one distinguish between those passages saying the Lord is at hand, which are 10 years apart, versus the one that's 20 years apart? And then at the same time, go to the book of Revelation and say at hand refers to the fall of Rome, which was like 400 years apart.
Well, I like to think about it like this. Let's just assume for a second they're right, that there is another coming of the Lord, the end, okay? Would it have been possible for that coming of the Lord to take place prior to AD 70? Because, see, if it does take place before AD 70, then Jesus' predictions concerning the fall of Jerusalem never come true.
Right.
Okay? Well, with Drew Leonard's position on Rome, that would mean that the real coming of the Lord could not take place until sometime after the fall of Rome. Now let's go back to one of the first brothers' presentations. Maybe it was the middle one.
Okay.
Richie. He said an important aspect of the second half of Matthew 24 is you have to watch. He tells them over and over again, watch, watch, watch. Well, if they knew the Roman army hadn't been destroyed yet, in 420 or whatever he says, then they know the coming of the Lord couldn't have taken place yet. And so you have a bunch of people watching for something that they know can't even happen for another 400 years.
Exactly. And it makes particularly the signs that Paul gave the Thessalonians irrelevant. And of course they argued that there were no signs, and they made a big point on the fact that there were no signs of the coming of the Lord when they were, and I think this might have been in Richie's lesson because he was dealing with Matthew 24 and 36. But here's the point. And even B.J. Clark talked about this a little bit in his lesson because he dealt with 2 Thessalonians 2 and talked about signs. But here's the deal. When the Thessalonians believed that Christ had already come, Paul said that day would not come except there would be a falling away first and the man of lawlessness be revealed. And therefore gave them signs so that they would know that the event had not occurred and that they were to watch for those signs before it would be near. If they claim that that is not a reference to the coming of the Lord, then they would have to eliminate that text from their eschatological vocabulary as a coming of the Lord text. And here's the double whammy from that. The man of lawlessness involved in that text was associated with the temple that was yet standing in Jerusalem, which would then take us back to Matthew 24 and the fulfillment of all things within that generation. So that creates some huge problems for them on that particular text.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, you know, they got problems everywhere they go.
Yeah.
You know, and there's nothing wrong with these brethren. They're good people. But there are issues with the doctrine that they're trying to defend. And so when you're trying to defend the false doctrine, it's undoubtedly that you're going to run into all these problems that they're running into. With 2 Thessalonians and Matthew 24 and Revelation, there's going to be inconsistencies because it's a false paradigm. So Drew Leonard's trying to put Paul against Jesus from our perspective is simply unfound. And another reason why is because of the difference between the King James Version and the New King James Version and other versions like it. Whether or not to translate that word as at hand or as has come. What are your doctorly thoughts on that, William?
Well, this question came up in the McGuigan-King debate. And of course, McGuigan, who Drew Leonard drew a lot of his arguments from, and I'm sure he either read that debate or read some of those writings, but I think he had the McGuigan debate as well. But that was one of the arguments that McGuigan made, and he really thought that it was a very solid argument. And Max just pointed out that the word in that text was inestemi, from histemi, which meant to have already come. It doesn't mean to be at hand. And that's the translation that Drew Leonard favored. He said we favor the King James Version, which says not just at hand or et cetera. And did I get the translation correct? Was it the King James Version?
Yes.
Yeah, not just at hand. And yet the text says had not come. So their understanding was that the day of the Lord had come, and Paul was not telling them that it was not at hand, which is the argument that he made. He was telling them that it had not already come. And as we've already mentioned, here you have Paul 10 years later, James, Peter, and John all saying that the coming of the Lord was at hand. So that, again, creates some problems.
And see, the translation of 2 Thessalonians 2:2 to being had come makes perfect sense when you consider the framework of that whole last days paradigm. In Matthew 24, what did Jesus say? He said there's going to be some coming prior to the end who are going to tell you, look, here's Christ, well, look, he's over there, saying that the Lord had already come. It's no different than what Hymenaeus and Philetus were doing in 2 Timothy chapter 2. And both parties had the same aim, and that was to bind the law of Moses on the Gentile brethren. That's what was going on in Acts chapter 17 with those at Thessalonica, and that's what was going on in 2 Timothy chapter 2. They were using the law unlawfully, which is what Paul said in 1 Timothy 1. It fits within the framework of what Jesus told them would happen in Matthew 24. They were the false teachers. They were the false apostles. They were writing letters as from us, trying to tell the church at Thessalonica that the Lord had already come, disassociating the coming of the Lord from the destruction of the temple as it ought to be.
Okay, very good. Well, without making this video long, are there any closing comments that you want to add at this point? Was there anything else that you wanted to cover that?
You might ought to mention the dying and rising again issue.
Okay. One of the arguments that was made by Drew Leonard was that you could not have a simultaneous dying and rising as far as the resurrection was concerned. And of course, he wanted to argue that they're dying on one hand and they're rising on the other. Well, the question was asked in 1 Corinthians 15, how are the dead ones raised up? And with what body do they come? And Paul said, thou fool, that which you sow is not made alive unless it dies. Now, I'm not a farmer nor the son of a farmer. I have planted a seed or two in my life, and I have read books about it, and I've also seen pictures about it. But the process of a seed germinating is one that involves a dying and a rising, and those are simultaneous and concurrent processes. In other words, the seed germinates, the life germ of the seed germinates through the death and decay of the other part of the seed. And sometimes when that seed comes up, you can still see a part of that process going on. So for him to claim that is for him to argue against the very analogy that Paul used in order to do it. Not only that, but he violates all the language, the linguistic evidence that is in the text in terms of how resurrection was occurring. And then made some serious blunders on a couple of passages that he quoted. But go ahead, Daniel. I see you got your Bible open. Why don't you comment on those points?
Yeah, I was going to go off something you just said. In verse 42 of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul literally is saying, so also is the resurrection of the dead. It is being sown, a perishable body. It is being raised, an imperishable body. You have a dying and you have the rising again.
Exactly.
Concurrent events, right.
And that language is very, very important. I remember, I think even during the days that I was, no, it was shortly after graduating from the School of Preaching. I think I was preaching at the congregation then. But I sat down and I went through the entire book of Corinthians, or chapter 15, and just did a word study on literally every single word in the text. And I still have it somewhere around here. And that's, you know, and if you take the time to do that, you will see the tense of these verbs are not speaking of events that were, you know, that were in the past, or events that were not concurrent. As he said, it is being raised. It is being sown. It is being raised. Here's another text. Go back to 1 Corinthians 15. We haven't said, you know, much about this, but there, you know, this creates some problems. They want a view that puts the body off in death, and then at some time in the future takes up the body, takes up the new body. That's not the teaching of the Bible. That's not what the resurrection doctrine is in the Bible. Paul mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, which is a parallel to 1 Corinthians 15, but he also states the same thing right here, as we've said from the actual statements. But Paul said, not that he wanted to be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. Now, in order that he not be found naked. Now, if you're going to take the physical body, or take resurrection and make it the physical body, and you put off your physical body in death, which means that in the interim of this alleged future return of Christ, you have no body. You are in the very state that Paul says he did not want to be in, and in fact the state that he says the Holy Spirit was given as a guarantee or an earnest to prevent that situation. Now here's the problem. We don't have the miraculous measure of the Holy Spirit today. So how in the world is the Holy Spirit going to prevent you from becoming naked, and you don't deny that you do, when you die and put off your physical body? So you're in a state of nakedness, the very state Paul says we don't want to be in, and the Holy Spirit was given, the miraculous outpouring of the Spirit, that eschatological Spirit in the last days, to prevent such from happening. That was their guarantee. And wow, if we talk about the Holy Spirit, then we really open up a can of worms. But go ahead,
Well,
Daniel, I know you got something to say.
Yeah, complimenting what you just said. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, if that's physical death and physical resurrection, he's saying, I don't want to die. I don't want to be unclothed. But in Philippians 1, what does he say? I want to depart. You know, he says, to die is to gain. And so there's obviously some contradictions there if we take that route. Real quick, one last point that I thought of that's just brilliant to bring up right now is something that he addressed in his lecture. He said, oh, these preterists, they're going to look at a passage that's talking about resurrection, and he said this. They're going to say, oh, that's just an Ezekiel 37 thing. Or, oh, that's just an Isaiah 25 or an Isaiah 26 thing. See, he admitted that Isaiah 25 and 26 was equivalent in a way to Ezekiel 37, in at least the sense it's not physical resurrection. Well, guess what 1 Corinthians 15 is all about? Paul says, once all of 1 Corinthians 15 is done, then shall come to pass the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 8, right?
That's right.
And so Paul is saying this whole text is about Isaiah 25:8. And Drew Leonard, I've got the direct quote here in my notes, and you can watch it online for yourself. He said, oh, they're just trying to figurize that like Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 25 and Ezekiel 37 are.
Yes. So very, very interesting comments. Well, what we'll do, Daniel, we'll probably do another video on this because there was so much said. And I literally walked up to a speaker and just told him, I said, there was so much false doctrine taught in that particular speech. And of course, you know, we've heard it over and over again. But we'll address some of those in another video coming up.
All right. Good to be with you, Leon.
All right. Same here. Thanks a lot. And thanks to you for watching. Stay tuned for another edition of the joint video production of Labor Not in Vain and All Things Fulfilled. I'm William Bell. This is Daniel Rogers. And we'll see you next time.